Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of 5 Facts. Today, we're talking about one of my favorite monster movies of all time, The Thing. The Thing is a 1982 John Carpenter movie. This is just an incredible piece of horror history. John Carpenter, who is a legend in his own right, often considers this to be the favorite of his films, and I'd have to agree. That's even over Big Trouble in Little China, They Live, and tons of others. Quick summary for the 6 of you that have not seen this movie. Basically, it is about a group of researchers in Antarctica that get infiltrated by an alien who can basically mimic anything it touches. It works at a cellular level, can start taking over dogs, humans, anything with biological life. And if they get attacked before, they kind of turn into these crazy Lovecraftian-style monsters. So, it turns into a thriller about finding out who's infected, who's not. It's filled with suspense and suspicion and so many other fun things that just make this a top-tier movie. Anyway, let's get to the facts. Fact number 1. The special effects took a huge toll on the crew. Rob Bottin headed up the special effects crew for The Thing, and he basically had to live on set for multiple months. This is a movie that had 11 months of pre-production going into it so that they could make sure that the monsters were in the best shape possible. His attention to detail is staggering on some of these monsters. First off, you see a lot of carved-in faces and stretching and all sorts of very practical effects that are happening in real time, not the claymation-style stuff you see in a lot of movies from this. They did have a piece of stop-motion animation that was actually at the end of the movie, but they didn't like how it looked with the rest of the effects, so they cut that out. One of my favorite monsters is basically the pissed-off cabbage. Something that Rob designed that has 12 dog tongues in a circle around a whole lamprey set of teeth. It's a really cool looking prop, and one of the creepier ones that you see in this, other than, heads crawling off and just so many others. While the effects are incredible, the stress started to get to Bodden as time went on. By the end of the movie, he had to be hospitalized because he had walking pneumonia, he had a bleeding ulcer, and basically he was just stressed to the point where he was breaking down. Initially, he was actually supposed to play the role of Palmer, but the special effects crew actually threatened to quit if they took him away just to do that. The burden of the movie was already going to be too great on the special effects team to have to worry about him learning his lines and being on set at the right time. Noted effects wizard Stan Winston actually helped with this movie as well, creating the dog thing when Bottin was out. He didn't want to be credited, though, because this really was Bottin's show and he wanted him to get the notoriety for these special effects. One last note on the effects, Wilford Brimley was one of the only people on the set who was comfortable during the autopsy scenes, because for a lot of these, they actually used internal organs from butchered cows and butchered other animals. This led to some bad smells, led to just kind of general grossness for people that aren't used to hunting or the cowboy lifestyle that Wilford Brimley actually lives. Turns out the diabetes guy is actually kind of a badass. Fact number 2, using dynamite on the set is dangerous. There's a spot where Kurt Russell chases Palmer out into the darkness, and while he's on fire, throws a stick of dynamite at him. This was an actual stick of dynamite that Kurt Russell threw, and when it exploded, it launched him back against the wall. Basically, they didn't know exactly how potent it was going to be, and it ended up hurting him a little bit. That reaction of shock and pain is pretty authentic. Good way to make a scene memorable is to almost kill your star cast member. At least more memorable than a scene where the guy's face splits in half and he literally eats a dude named Windows. Fact number 3. The Thing was a financial flop in theaters, and E.T. is partly to blame. The Thing cost more than $14 million to make, and only made about $20 million domestically. This was largely, in fact, that it was in the shadow of another alien movie that came out at the exact same time called E.T. Steven Spielberg made a much less nihilistic and angry version of an alien movie, and in the 80s that seemed to resonate a little bit more with people. On top of that, it came out the same week as Blade Runner, the Ridley Scott classic, which, oddly enough, was also panned by critics. Both of these movies were not very well received when they first came out, but have come over time to be genre-defining films for both sci-fi and horror. The critics didn't like how dark and gloomy they were, they didn't like the atmosphere, they didn't like the characters, they thought that it was just a little bit too surface level for The Thing. They wanted to know more about these characters. I thought that the pacing was perfect and we were able to pick up a lot of subtext from how these characters acted. Just an example of some of the things that the critics used to say. One said, John Carpenter was never meant to direct horror science fiction. He's better suited to direct traffic accidents, train wrecks, and public floggings. Yet, even with all this negative attention at the time, they would go on to be huge in VHS sales, and currently have an 8.2 on IMDb and an 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. Fact number 4. The US camp and the Norwegian camp are actually the same set. John Carpenter's always been thrifty in his work. He decided that he could save some money by filming these out of order, where the American camp is where most of the movie takes place all the way up until the end, and then after they burn it down, they decide to make that the Norwegian camp, just using different angles to make it look like a different place. They picked the spot in British Columbia outside of a town called Stewart because it's one of the snowiest places on the continent, and they wanted to make sure that they could have some snowfall. This was a particularly challenging spot because there was only one road to get there, and filming often took place in negative 15-degree weather. On a side note, all of the interior shots were actually done in Los Angeles on a soundstage, where the temperature was lowered all the way down to 40 degrees to make it look like the actors were a little bit rosy-cheeked and cold. This was while there was a heat wave going on in LA and everything was over 100 degrees. So that explains a little bit of why the budget got inflated for that air conditioning bill. Fact number 5. Watching The Thing has become a tradition among Antarctic scientists. At the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, Antarctica, it is a tradition to watch The Thing. Every June 21st during their midwinter festival, they end up watching this movie together and basically probably freaking themselves out for quite a while. I can't imagine being isolated in a base in Antarctica and having to deal with all of this. In the Northern Hemisphere, they have a similar tradition. At the summit camp on the Greenland ice sheet, they actually do this kind of at the opposite side since the Northern Hemisphere has the exact opposite winter. The Thing is an absolutely fascinating piece of horror. It somehow manages to make being isolated feel entirely claustrophobic. Like you're thousands of miles from anything, but it feels like you're in a coffin. And it doesn't even have to do that with space. Like you see that a lot with sci-fi movies where you're in space, but this is just a bunch of people in a research base, completely surrounded by white. It digs deep into the psyche of the survivors as they know one of their friends could be an alien monster. They don't know if they're the only one that's left that isn't a monster. They know that if they guess wrong, it could be the end of them as much as it could be the very end of humanity. It deals with the concept of losing the self, of slowly being eaten cell by cell and becoming something monstrous and terrible. And it also gives an awesome example of one of my favorite tropes of self-sacrifice. There's a moment in self-sacrifice where people hit a wall, they understand there's a point of no return, and basically the only thing they can do is just burn it down. And for me, that's always been a really fun trope to explore. More than all this, it's a movie that shows the benefits of practical effects and what you can do whenever you've got a concentrated team trying to make something special and incredible. Every once in a while, something looks a little bit like a rubber tube, but a lot of the puppets, a lot of the just effects that they put into this made it so realistic and so terrifying. I'm honestly having a hard time thinking of a movie with better practical horror effects. And that says something because there's so much good body horror out there. Anyway, that's going to do it for 5 Facts this week. I'd love to hear what you guys think about The Thing, especially about some of the alternate endings, some of the different histories, and some of the different ideas on who may or may not be infected. There's a lot of cool stuff there, so please put that in the comments. Also, if anyone has played the PlayStation 2 game, I'd like to ask some questions about it because I've always been curious if that was a good game. I know it's actually considered to be canon with John Carpenter as well, so I'd like to know a little bit more about that. Hit up the comments. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit a like, throw this on Twitter. Helps us get this channel bigger, helps us make more 5 Facts videos. Also check out the Human Echoes podcast because it's awesome. Hope you guys have a great day.